Top Med Talk.
Well, hello and welcome to Top Med Talk. I'm Desiree Chappell, your host, and we're covering the COVID-19 pandemic and crisis from the front lines. Now, if you've been listening, you know our conversation in the past weeks have spanned the globe, and we're going to continue to bring latest updates as long as we're able to before we're actually called into action. Now, normally I'm joined by our editor-in-chief, Monty Mythen from London, England. But again, if you've been following us, you know that Monty has tested positive for coronavirus. He was diagnosed officially about 4 days ago. He's on about day 7, day 8. And so we're going to see how it progresses. He's feeling a bit rough, I know, these last couple of days. So Monty, we're sending you all kinds of well wishes for a very, very speedy recovery. Get well soon because we need you on Top Med Talk. But honestly, your patients need you there in England. So we hope to hear from you soon. Now, our mission is to go straight to the source to speak with our guests. So we want to go to those people who are on the front lines, who are driving care and practice within the perioperative space. Now, our next guest is a friend of the Top Med Talk family. He's a well-known anaesthetist, but he's otherwise known as the father of perioperative medicine, Ross Kerridge. Hi, Ross.
Hi, Desiree. It's always good to talk.
Now, Ross, tell our listeners where you're from and what your role is.
I'm in Newcastle in Australia. We're sort of post-industrial city in Australia. It's the biggest coal port in the world. So we're bringing you climate change at the moment, although obviously, how much longer that's going to continue for. And that's an existential challenge for our city and all that. But and thank you. Yes, I've been involved in doing perioperative medicine since about 1984. So
you started writing that early on, didn't you? You're one of the first people to start talking about perioperative medicine, weren't you?
Yeah, that's a funny thing to think of. But so that puts me on the more mature side of 60.
Oh,
surely now.
The young side of it, the Ross, the young side of it.
Of 60.
So Ross, you still are a practicing anaesthetist there. Which hospital are you at?
At John Hunter Hospital, which is the main hospital in Newcastle.
Okay. And tell us just about what the profile of the hospital looks like. How many beds?
Well, Australian standards, we're quite big. We've got about 950 beds, second busiest trauma service in the country. And funnily enough, and not recognised, we're the busiest neurosurgical centre in Australia, although not many people realise that. By international standards, we're not so big. But nevertheless, we have a big emergency load because of the nature of the Australian health system. A lot of the elective work is done in private hospitals, whereas the emergency workload tends to be done in the big university tertiary teaching hospitals like John Hunter. So,
gotcha. A huge regional center there.
Yep.
So Ross, I just kind of wanted to get a feel for what is happening there in Australia. Now, I know that we just talked about this. You recently just arrived back from the United States just about 2 weeks ago, right?
Yep, I'm out of quarantine tomorrow. I've been in our house for 2 weeks. I can go out on the veranda, but otherwise I've been in our house for 2 weeks. Yeah, I can go out tomorrow, so I'm back at work tomorrow.
I bet you're ready to get in there, aren't you, Ross?
Well, it's been a strange experience, but we haven't killed each other yet. So.
Yeah. It's good. You're growing. Yeah. That's what it's going to be like when you retire, right?
I was lucky in that when I came in, it was just a declaration that you had to self-isolate. But as of last weekend, the governments have mandated that you actually go into a supervised quarantine under police guard, some of them in fancy hotels, but it doesn't matter, even if it's a 5-star hotel, when you're locked up in your room and can't go out, it's not.
It doesn't matter what you're locked into. It all feels kind of like a jail cell a little bit, I'm sure. Well, yeah. Ross, I would assume that you're still connecting with the hospital and as senior leader there within your facility. So tell us what's happening there.
Well, at the government level, there's been, in retrospect, the government could have done things earlier than they've done. Particularly in the last 10 days, they've really come on strong, and we're now in enforced lockdown. No one is allowed outside. Gatherings of more than 2 people outside are illegal, and non-essential movement is illegal. You can be jailed for up to 6 months.
Oh my goodness.
So essentially you can go to work. If you are still working, you can go to hospital or to doctors, and you can go for designated shopping. But other than that, you can only go out for exercise that is regarded as an essential activity, but only in the company of one other person.
Well, Ross, that seems really aggressive, which we can weigh out whether or not that's a positive. But what's the general public opinion about that?
Well, there's been some dissent, but I must say, from what I'm seeing on television and reports from friends, people are taking it. And it's easy to focus on those who aren't.
Yeah.
But most people are doing it. They say it's absolutely deathly quiet out on the streets. But we need to flatten the curve so that when the surge comes through, it stays within our intensive care capacity. And in the meantime, everyone is training in all the routines for putting on their PPE, donning and doffing correctly, managing intubations, all the appropriate procedures for distancing in hospital. And people are taking it pretty seriously.
So, Ross, have you guys seen your first cases there in Newcastle? Are you still awaiting?
Oh, yeah. We've got a few people in intensive care. We're on the steep part of the curve, but of course, everything we're doing now is to control things in 2 weeks' time. It's not for tomorrow, but
is the prediction that you will heat up and start seeing the apex of that curve in about 2 weeks' time?
Yeah, we're on the steep part of the curve. And the effort is all about trying to flatten the curve and slow the rate of rise. For the last 3 days, there has been some signs that the numbers are slowing down, but of course it's far too early to be certain of that. But let's hope so.
Yeah. Over here in the US, I know in the UK, it's been a major issue to have enough supplies to take care of these patients. And of course, there's the conversation that people are having. Did we prepare enough? Did we protect our supply chains and things like that? What's happening there in Australia? Do you all have enough personal protective equipment?
Depends on how high the surge goes.
Right.
Yeah, there are concerns about the supply of PPE. We're getting varying messages at high levels in government. They've been putting in controls to guard the medical stockpile, to stop inappropriate use, looting and just waste. Some places are putting in moves to recover things like N95 masks after use and just putting them in garbage bags and storing them in rooms to keep them there. If things go really bad, then we may need to look at reusing them, and there's some working parties looking at what would be the effective ways of re-sterilising them. Obviously, that is a frightening thought for some people, but I must admit, I think it's a great idea, because if things get really out of control and there really is nothing left to use, an N95 mask that's been stored in a highly desiccated environment or maybe gamma radiated or whatever, it's not perfect, but it will still be preferable to nothing at all. So,
absolutely,
I think not throwing them away is, it's just keeping your options open.
Yeah,
But it has been a bit of a controversial point.
Yeah. Take lessons, I think, from those that have gone before you, because I know that, people in New York, they're begging for anything, any kind of protective equipment. And I know that in many facilities across the US, people have been having to work for weeks without appropriate PPE because they were starting to hold some back because they were worried about the supplies. And I think 14% of the cases in Italy were healthcare workers, at least. I know that there were thousands of healthcare workers in China that were sick and died, and it's becoming an issue here in the United States. So hopefully that will be something that you can keep kind of stockpiled. And that new study, I don't know if you saw that today, came out from Duke about the utilization of UV sterilization for those. So I'm sure in the coming weeks, there'll be even more to come out on that.
Yep.
So for sure. Speaking of PPEs and protecting healthcare workers and protecting each other, we had this conversation about the fact it's kind of going back to the basics, right? So look, those traditional practices.
Exactly. And there's this wonderful term, the Pax Antibiotica, which is a Latin term, and in the days of the old Roman Empire, they used to talk about the Pax Romanus, which was the peace that the Roman Empire gave to all the people of Europe. And the Pax Antibiotica, the idea is that there's been a war for billions of years between all living creatures and germs. And in a sense, the development of penicillin and the other powerful antibiotics 70 years ago heralded a peace in that war. And we've got lazy and we've forgotten all the lessons of dealing in a world of infection. And, if we go back, and I'm lucky because my father was a surgeon, my mother was a nurse of the old school, and of course, my father would be 100 years old next week. And so I grew up learning what it was like in the old days.
Yeah.
And old hospitals used to be spaced out. They'd have big wide verandas so that you could put patients out in the sunshine with fresh air. And there was an absolute rigor and fastidiousness about cleaning. They were obsessed by it.
Yeah.
And attention to detail and routines and discipline. And there was a real military air, particularly about nurses. And we sort of have laughed at that. And even just hand hygiene. And the importance of washing your hands and all those old things that we've forgotten, that if you rush, if you rush through procedures, if you have a schedule on your operating list that's too quick and your turnover is too short and you don't pay attention to details, you yell at the orderly when they're trying to mop the floor or the cleaners when they're trying to clean things or decontaminate instruments and whatever, then things get missed and infection breaks out as a result. And they're the old lessons that we need to relearn. And if we do that, in China and in Korea, in Singapore, that's what they've done, that they've been absolutely fastidious about doing all those things.
Yes.
And they haven't, I hear people talking about guidelines and say, this is not a time for guidelines. This is a time for absolute rigor, both in hospitals and socially as well, that we've got to say, no, there is no choice. These are the rules and you're going to do it.
Yeah.
And let's face it, a lot of what we've talked about on Top Med Talk, or you've talked about.
We've talked about.
Yeah. But, a whole lot of the perioperative initiatives and ERAS and all these things is about getting high levels of compliance and high levels of attention to detail and following the same routine all the time in terms of managing surgical patients. And that when we do that, as Henrik Kellett has always been saying about, getting patients out of bed early, that it's about having a process and sticking to the process and making sure that everybody does it consistently and there's consistent messaging to the patients. As soon as we start planning their operation, that we should be saying, on the evening of your operation, after your operation, we'll be getting you out of bed. The next day you will be doing this. And so everyone's singing from the same song sheet.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very standardized, everything that they're doing.
Yeah. And so, we're doing that about infection control and it does work.
Yeah, it absolutely does work. Tell me a little bit about some of the other aspects to the response that we can, kind of think about and ponder.
Yeah. Look, I like to think of these things in terms of three aspects in healthcare. And there's the sort of things that we do, the tasks and the skills and the equipment that we need. And that's the sort of physical thing. And we've got to get that right. And then there's knowing what to do. And so there's the cognitive thing and having the science and making appropriate evidence-based decisions and all that sort of thing. And of course, we've paid a lot of attention to that. But there's something else as well. And there's the emotional side of it. And you could call it emotional or ethical or spiritual or whatever. But there's all that business about what we need to do. And then you could say, you remember that old saying, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. Well, now there is something to fear, but fear is part of the problem. And I think I saw a thing on Twitter this morning. It's like the backbone of medicine is being remineralized, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it. But
yeah, interesting
being in healthcare, and this is another old lesson, being in healthcare isn't just a job. And yes, it's exciting and it's glamorous, but there's also a whole lot of things that we do in healthcare that are, pretty gross and disgusting, and dealing with messy things and doing, awful things, smelly procedures, but doing them competently and calmly. And there's the emotional things that we have to deal with, of seeing kids getting cancers and bad traumas and all of those awful things that we need to have the emotional resilience to deal with that. And there are patients who might be ungrateful and even violent, but there's also the risk of infection. And to some extent, I think, that's why being in healthcare isn't just a job. There's an element of vocation, and we need to rediscover that. Maybe we've forgotten that too, that because I suppose you could sum it up by saying that healthcare isn't just a job, that there's an element of a vocation about it. And I think the community has traditionally understood that, and maybe we've forgotten that in the last, there's been a little bit of the culture of the last 20 or 30 or 40 years has been all about celebrity and narcissism and, making lots of money and having a flashy car. But maybe we need to start honouring that healthcare is a team game. Like when I leave hospital each afternoon, one of the cleaners, and she's the regular cleaner, and we often seem to intersect as she's doing the staircase coming up from where my office is, and she's mopping the stairs. And I don't know her name, but I try and be polite to her. But I think hospitals would be a complete mess if it wasn't for the cleaners. Absolutely. And we need to honour them, and the orderlies and all those other people. I mean, the doctors and nurses are the ones that everyone sees and gives the stars to, but we're all part of it, and we need to honour that.
Absolutely. I just saw an article talking about, it's kind of like the forgotten of this whole system are those people that keep the hospitals running. So not just the nurses, just like you said, not just the nurses and the doctors, the ones that come in and do some of the really dirty work for us. Yep. So we need to honor them as well.
Yeah.
You wrote a beautiful piece for the Newcastle Herald. It was an opinion piece, but it was honoring our courageous frontline force.
Okay. Yes. Well, thanks, Desiree.
This was a quote. We're being reminded that even in the antibiotic era, there remains a real threat of infection from patients to healthcares. All these realities are reminders of why being a nurse, a doctor, or any other healthcare worker is not just a job.
Yeah.
I think that sums it up really nicely.
And some of us have already died, and others are going to die. And I see photos on Twitter of, the young doctors, this whole young generation who have grown up in the era of greed is good, and yet they've stepped up to the mark, and they are stepping into the shoes of, the heroes of the past. The nurses who went to war, the doctors on the Burma Railway, the slave railway, they're stepping up to the mark, and I'm just so inspired by them.
It's really been a golden era. I mean, we haven't really faced challenges. Those in my generation, in our 40s and younger, 50s and younger, Monty's brought this up several times about the AIDS epidemic and what that looked like and the fear that people had during that. Now, obviously, that was a much longer, protracted time frame. But do you see, how does it compare and I guess really contrast to that?
Well, I suppose, yes, the time frame. But we had to relearn a whole lot of things. And there was a time, particularly early on, when we weren't sure how it was transmitted. That's why Princess Diana going into the AIDS hospital and shaking hands with the patients with bare hands was such an amazing thing, that she was showing that, no, it's not transmitted that way, and that we can do that. And of course, now we're so much more relaxed about it, and our attitudes have changed. But we had to relearn a whole lot of things then, and there was fear, but this is a whole lot worse in terms of the fear. But we've got to step up and deal with it.
Yeah.
And when we do, we're going to get through this. And people are going to fall along the way. They're not going to fall. People are going to give their lives. They're not going to lose their lives. Healthcare workers are going to give their lives. But we're going to get through this. And we're going to make the world a better place. And at the end of it, we'll count our blessings, and we need to be kind to each other, and we need to pick up the phone to some of those people isolated at home, particularly the oldies.
Yeah.
And I think afterwards, in 3 months or 6 months' time, we're going to be the ones still in steady jobs and relatively financially secure. And there are going to be a whole lot of other people who will have taken a big economic hit out of this. I've got one of my colleagues called a florist that she used to get flowers from occasionally and said, I want a big bunch of flowers every Monday for the next 6 months, just as a way of saying, look, you're going to be getting some regular income from me. And things like that are really going to matter. And maybe if there's doing some work on the house that will employ a tradesman, maybe thinking about doing it a little bit sooner than you would have otherwise, in 6 months' time. In the meantime, let's get in there and take this on, and we'll beat it.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful point, Ross. I'm glad that you said that. I think sometimes we often we're so deep down inside of this that we forget to kind of pop our heads up and realize what else is happening. So much of the public they're supporting these healthcare workers around the world, and to give a little bit of that back once we're through and over this mountain, for sure. Ross, it is always such a wonderful pleasure to talk with you. And I can't tell you how much we really appreciate you always sitting down with us on Top Med Talk. And I'm sure there's a lot of emotions that you're feeling as you head back into deep in the trench there and on the ground. But we wish you the best of luck. Please stay safe. And
you.
Yeah.
And let's hope that Monty keeps getting better.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yep.
Hurry back to us, Monty. And when it's all done, we're going to have a big party in Dingle this year.
We're going to
Hopefully
have a big party. Year. We'll have a big virtual party all around the world.
We should have a big virtual party. And talking about calling up people, there are so many different platforms online that you can get, and anybody can use them to call or to have online, in-person, or online meetings that you can use your webcams and things like that. So don't forget to call your grandparents or your mom and dad or, your kids if you get a chance. So Ross, thanks again. We'll check in with you soon. Okay, buddy?
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Well wishes to all of you.
Top Med Talk.
Thank you for listening to Top Med Talk. You can always find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and on topmedtalk.com. We want everyone to stay safe. If you have any questions or you want to talk to us on Top Med Talk, please reach out via contact@topmedtalk.com. That's contact@topmedtalk. Thanks for listening.